humanitarian and legal approaches. So with that, I commend the bill to the House.
Speaker.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
Madam Speaker, I rise to speak in favour of this bill progressing at the second stage. Can I thank the members of the Select Committee who've provided the report to the House. The Deputy Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Winston Peters, has well described the effect of this proposed regulatory regime for the brokering of weapons and military equipment by New Zealanders. It's unusual for legislation to regulate offshore activity, and this is one of those rare instances where New Zealand seeks to regulate the behaviour of New Zealanders when they're out of the country, rather than just those New Zealanders being effectively subject to the legislative code of overseas countries. This bill applies to New Zealanders when they're at home and when they or their entities are operating offshore, and it requires New Zealand citizens, New Zealand ordinary residents, New Zealand entities wishing to engage in brokering to register with the Secretary of Foreign Affairs and Trade and obtain a permit for their brokering activity. As other speakers have probably already said, the Secretary can only grant permits if he or she is satisfied that the activity is consistent with New Zealand's international obligations and additionally doesn't prejudice the security, defence or international relations of New Zealand. It's a piece of legislation that is necessary to bring us into line with the multilateral trade agreement, the Arms Trade Treaty, which New Zealand ratified in 2014 to regulate the international trade in conventional arms. As the Select Committee report notes, this flows from that international agreement. This is one of those many pieces of legislation which enjoys broad support in the House. It's seen by me as being almost, well, I suppose I was going to call it a housekeeping bill, but it's not really. It goes further than seeing to a tidy up of existing legislation, but takes New Zealand regulatory regime further and imposes obligations on those who want to broker weapons in either New Zealand or overseas jurisdictions. A weapon is or a related item is a good that's specified in a strategic goods list, which is defined in the bill as being on a list which is provided for under the Customs and Excise Act, and brokering activity is defined as people would ordinarily understand it to be. It's effectively being as an intermediary for the arrangement, facilitation or negotiating of a transaction that involves the international transaction, a transfer of weapons or related items, as I've already described, and that is from a place outside New Zealand to another place outside of New Zealand. So this is a sensible piece of legislation. The Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee were provided with advice from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and they're a very capable ministry and very careful in the advice they proffer to the Select Committee. There is a change recommended by the Select Committee in respect of offences committed outside New Zealand. There's a deletion proposed to clause 33(1)(a)(3) of the bill, so that the bill will not apply to a person who has been found in New Zealand, has not been extradited. The Select Committee say that they didn't think that this provision was fit for purpose within the context of the bill because it would have treated an offence as one attracting universal jurisdiction, whereas the offence in clause 10 relates to carrying out brokering activity without the requisite registration or permit in New Zealand, rather than prohibiting engaging in brokering activity per se. And so it notes that the committee understands that foreign nationals with no physical presence or link to New Zealand wouldn't be registered under the New Zealand brokering regime, and therefore they recommend deletion of clause 33(1) of the Act, or of the bill. There's a record keeping obligation that's imposed. Obviously, in order to police these things, you have to require those people who are involved in this activity to keep records, and the committee recommends extending the obligation to keep records from 5 years to 7 years, which seems a sensible recommendation. Madam Speaker, that said, I would just simply recount that the application of this Act in practice will be through the Secretary for Foreign Affairs and Trade. The Secretaries will probably delegate that function to others within the organisation at times. The bill has been around for a little while. It was introduced on the 27th of June 2017. The committee reported back to the House on the 29th of March and has recommended unanimously, with the support of all parties in Parliament who sit on the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Select Committee, who include members from the Greens as well as Labour Party, New Zealand First and National, accordingly I've got great confidence that this legislation that's proposed for second reading should be passed. Now, I don't feel the need to waste the time of the House filibustering in the way that the National Party used to do, so I'll sit down now.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Todd McRae.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for ceding the floor so that I can speak so early in this debate.